Cyclic Quantum Cosmology, Episode 5, The Evolutionary Line of the Geometric Zero. Introductory note. In the process of defining this geometric mechanical model, it often happens that one must revisit concepts already introduced, observing them from a different, more in-depth and mature perspective. This stratified approach is fundamental to best explaining the individual evolutionary steps without overloading the narrative right from the beginning. For example, the string, which in the first descriptive phases might have appeared almost as a two-dimensional entity or a simple surface filament, is now revealed in its three-dimensional nature within the grid. Yet, we will return to this fundamental point again in the next chapters, as its ultimate mechanical essence has not yet been entirely unveiled. This method of progressive deepening will guide the entire treatment of the Manifesto, the code of elementary behavior to understand how the geometric zero, the grid of space merely devoid of loads, transforms into waves of the spectrum, light, and finally into complex structures. It is necessary to isolate the fundamental mechanical rules that govern the microcosm. Inside the multidimensional bulk, the universe is not a passive container, but a dynamic three-dimensional lattice whose elementary building blocks are governed by a rigid and deterministic code of behavior. The system is based on only two fundamental entities: the string. It constitutes the geometric substance of space. It is represented, as we will see below, by volumetric fragments endowed with torsion born from the rupture of the large primordial slabs during the Big Bang, genuine little pieces of moving, empty space. It possesses a precise structural tolerance and can exist in only three states: binding to another string to weave the three-dimensional texture of space, binding to a brain, hosting it on board, or closing in on itself in an isolated state devoid of loads, configuring itself as a graviton. The brain, it is, in every respect, what we define and measure as energy. It is not a mathematical abstraction or an immaterial concept, but a real substance. Due to its intrinsic properties, a brain cannot bind directly to another brain. It can manifest within our subsystem only by coupling with a string, or remain in a free and floating state in the external bulk. Contrary to classical physics, which imagines energy sliding over a fixed spatial background, the mechanical model inverts this relationship. Brains, energy, are stationary vectors, while it is the strings that, by sliding, swapping places, or joining within the lattice, physically carry the brains with them. Time is flow, and the paradox of the pebble. A fundamental question concerns the origin of movement. Why is this geometric broth perennially alive and dynamic, instead of stabilizing in a motionless state? The answer requires redefining the very concept of time. Time is not an absolute dimension that is born or dies with the Big Bang. It is the mechanical flow of the brain from one string to another. Being tied to this flowing, it experiences accelerations, decelerations, and dilations depending on the density of the lattice. This concept indissolubly unites space and time into a single dynamic entity. Space-time is not composed of two different things, but is the effect of the same mechanical operation. We are only able to conceive four dimensions, three spatial plus one temporal. However, just as a two-dimensional being crawling on a sheet of paper will never perceive height and will see a three-dimensional sphere only as a circle expanding and contracting, so we must not make the mistake of projecting our limited coordinates onto the entire bulk. In the infinite possibilities of the bulk, there exist regions or universes where three-dimensional space or time do not exist at all, because strings and brains are not configured to weave that kind of warp. There is no logical reason to establish an absolute beginning or end to linear time or space. In our aeon, the perennial movement is the effect of a violation of the primordial kinematic equilibrium, explainable through the analogy of the pebble. In a closed and isolated system, if a pebble is thrown upward, it starts from a condition of rest with respect to its potential. During the ascent, kinetic energy is transformed into potential energy up to the point of maximum height. Finally, the pebble falls back down, returning exactly to the starting point and restoring the equilibrium of the original zero. In the evolution of the universe, this return to zero cannot occur. At the moment of the first Big Bang, understood as the kinematic collision between the large brains and the bulk, the internal energy of the newborn subsystem was in an initial state of absolute rest. The colossal impact injected an immense amount of kinetic energy from the bulk, projecting the strings outward. Mechanically, the strings would tend to reverse their motion to discharge the acquired energy and go back toward the 0 point of geometric equilibrium. This mechanical tendency to return, that is, the elastic reaction of the strings trying to nullify the deformation suffered, is exactly what on a macroscopic level we perceive and measure as gravity. However, the exact geometric coordinate of the first Big Bang no longer exists, since space itself, under the thrust of the collision, has expanded, shifted, and deformed. No longer finding the original coordinate on which to discharge, the acquired kinetic energy remains trapped forever within the system, condemning the universe to a widespread elastic tension and to a state of perpetual agitation and movement. The 1-to-1 ratio, the primordial wave broth, and the dark universe in the initial post-impact state of the first Big Bang, strings and brains tend to maintain an ideal structural equilibrium ratio of 1-to-1. However, in low-intensity conditions, meaning in regions of the spatial lattice far from perturbations or extreme forces, the flexibility of the string allows it to absorb and host on board small amounts of brains. These geometric microvariations, strings traveling loaded with reduced amounts of brains, constitute on a macroscopic level the unsaturated waves of the physical spectrum. In this initial phase, the primordial universe configures itself as an immense space completely dark. Visible light does not yet exist. Only the first Big Bang is at work, and the system remains confined in a dynamic equilibrium, but devoid of macroscopic energy emissions. An undulatory broth in perennial motion, in which geometric waves of different types circulate, not yet saturated. This original equilibrium of the moving broth is altered by the internal activity of the lattice, when strings begin to invade the space of other strings that are in a different state of equilibrium. Through these accidental kinematic contacts, as the strings slide past each other swapping positions, a transfer of load occurs. It is enough for a single string to subtract and absorb one extra brain from another to alter the pre-existing homogeneity and equilibrium, without however ever breaking the undulatory nature of this dark universe. The continuous and perennial mechanical noise generated by the sliding and by these load exchanges of the brains on the strings, which we perceive and receive directly as background noise, coincides exactly with the cosmic microwave background, CMB, captured by astrophysicists. Hypotheses in the bulk, and the second Big Bang, this state of widespread and dark undulatory agitation, would remain a perennial equilibrium if a second Big Bang did not occur in the immediate vicinity of our subsystem, generated by the impact of new elements in the bulk. Before this second collision influences our universe, two physical scenarios unfold based on the rules of geometric compatibility in the bulk. Case A: total incompatibility. If the strings and brains of the two different Big Bangs are totally incompatible with each other, the close collision produces no lasting effects. The entities move away from each other without anything happening, leaving the primordial universe in its original state of dark broth in perennial motion. Case B: minimal compatibility. If there exists even a minimal geometric compatibility, the strings of the second Big Bang, penetrating into our system, latch onto and bind directly with the strings of the first Big Bang. Mechanical inflation and the destiny of the brains, the meeting and latching between the strings of the second Big Bang and those of the first Big Bang, generate a devastating macroscopic phenomenon that crowds the original system, cosmic inflation. This forced bond between the two lattices causes an immediate volumetric increase, enormously expanding and amplifying the common space. Within this crowded and rapidly expanding common space, not all brains react in the same way. It will be purely kinematic chance, and not belonging to the first or second Big Bang, that defines their evolutionary destiny. Reactive and compatible brains. The brains that find themselves in the right conditions of compatibility and mechanical interaction actively enter the subsequent evolutionary chain. It will be these that undergo the processes of compression, torsion, and accumulation that will guide the system toward the successive phases. Free brains, dark energy. The brains that remain free and devoid of geometric compatibility with the new lattice will not mechanically interact with the rest of the evolving structures. They will continue to float freely, occupying geometric volume in the interstices, but without being able to aggregate into heavy matter or into saturated waves. They do not act as a kinetic propulsive thrust, but rather as an incompressible fluid that generates an intrinsic tension of the vacuum. This geometric incompatibility forces the three-dimensional grid to constantly widen to make room for their presence, manifesting macroscopically as dark energy. Residual strings, dark matter. At the same time, a portion of the strings connected with the brains that do not possess the prerequisites to interact with the new energy flows of the second impact will remain excluded from the main evolutionary dynamics. They will continue to exist within the spatial fabric as a residual and unchanged primordial broth. This invisible and non-reactive component, which does not interact with light, but exerts a geometric mechanical presence in the lattice, constitutes dark matter. However, despite being isolated from energy flows, within them, there always remains the mechanical tendency to seek equilibrium and to respond to the general elastic deformation toward the geometric zero. Consequently, we perceive this structural presence of theirs uniquely through the interaction with gravity. The distortion of space and the photon limit under the effect of the crowding and the mechanical thrust impressed by the second Big Bang. The reactive brains undergo crazy pressure gradients associated with a deep distortion of space and geometric torsions of the lattice. In this colossal compression, the brains are crammed from one string to another, drastically reducing the grid's interstices and pushing away the gravitons. This specific distortion of space finally allows the strings to massively increase the number of brains hosted on board. Under the action of this new geometric pressure, the strings progressively accumulate additional brain energy, moving and rising along the different frequencies of the spectrum, yet still remaining in the portion of unsaturated waves. The process advances until the forced accumulation pushes the strings to reach the point of maximum undulatory absorption allowed by their structural tolerance. It is exactly at this point that we encounter the photon limit, the threshold that sanctions the birth of the universe's first true light. When a string is brought to maximum undulatory compression and becomes completely saturated with brains, it does not break, but continues to travel along the lattice as a saturated wave. This limiting case of absorption and undulatory saturation is what we mechanically define and measure as a photon. The binary perspective of the cosmos and the anticipation of the quantum limbo, this paradigm shift, does not intend to deny the achievements of cutting-edge physics, but rather to provide a new interpretative lens for those conceptual nodes that classical models fail to untie. Nothing else has been done but restoring to space its dignity as a real, dynamic, and tangible entity. It is not a mathematical vacuum, but a warp generated by the continuous interaction of strings and brains. It is possible to draw an illuminating parallelism with modern computer science. The entire complexity of the digital world is born from the sequential alternation of only two elementary states, 0 and 1. In our model, the string, the empty geometric space, the 0, and the brain, the energy load, the 1, operate exactly the same way. From their geometric and mechanical combinations, the entire fabric of reality develops. This key of interpretation allows for connecting the infinitesimal microcosm of quantum mechanics with the relativity of the macrocosm. If we look at the base, quantum physics is the interaction of photons and energy exchanges, which are also codifiable in a binary form of strings and brains. When billions of these entities unite, they create stable matter elements, neutrinos, electrons, atoms, starting from the infinitely small. If we imagine this evolution along a line, strings absorb brains starting from low-intensity energies up to reaching the limit saturation of the photon. A moment after this limit, if even an infinitesimal fraction of energy is added, the system collapses and transforms into heavy matter. If it loses it, it returns to manifesting as a pure photon. Precisely in this critical passage between the wave-photon state and the matter state, something extraordinary happens. The photon temporarily crosses borders into a dimension that we, limited four-dimensional beings, cannot see in our reality, exactly as two-dimensional beings do not perceive the third dimension of the sphere. In this infinitesimal limbo of the infinitesimal, the photon transits through an environment of the bulk devoid of linear coordinates of space and time. Finding itself in a point of non-space and non-time, it can connect instantaneously with anything else in its universe, even billions of light years away, and then re-enter our reality. It is precisely in this mechanical transition outside our three-dimensional fabric that lies the geometric explanation of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The photon becomes indeterminate, because a part of it is in the limbo, and of the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. Long-distance contact is instantaneous, because at the point of passage space and time do not exist at all. But this incredible journey into the microcosm will be the central topic of the next episode. Request appeal. We have reached the end of this chapter, a journey that has led us to unhinge the foundations of what current physics calls dark energy and dark matter, up to revealing the geometric motor that ignites the stars. But this model does not want to remain just theory. It wants to be a cultural and scientific revolution. And to make it happen, a team is needed. Today, we address you on 3 different levels. For simple enthusiasts, if this geometric mechanical vision of the cosmos fascinates you and you want to support the spread of free thought, subscribe to the channel right away and join our group so you don't miss the next episodes. Share this video. Your sharing is the motor that drives this idea beyond the boundaries of algorithms. For physicists, mathematicians, and researchers, if you are tired of the usual dogmas or ghost particles invented out of thin air, and you glimpse a concrete and coherent logic in these explanations, don't just watch. Contact us. We want to create a technical working group to start translating these geometric insights into mathematical formulas and equations. 3. For investors, entrepreneurs, and patrons, developing and validating a manifesto of this magnitude requires stable resources. If you believe that independent scientific research deserves an opportunity and you want to fund this idea, your economic support will allow for the birth and sustenance of a true research center dedicated to this alternative cosmology. If you want to be part of this change, if you want to collaborate or support the project, write to us directly at manos@setifup.it or leave a comment below. The universe is mechanical, elastic, and simple. Help us prove it. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next episode.